Human, are you really choosing me?
I'm choosing you, Lyra. I never cared what planet you came from.
Even after seeing what I am?
I only care about you.
Then, I'm not alone anymore.
You'll never be alone again.
Promise me?
Recording for OSI, Personal Encryption Level 2, Elias Rourke said to the empty cabin of the shuttle. The station was 40 minutes away, growing slowly in the viewport, and he had learned over the years that the things worth saying were worth saying before you arrived rather than after. I need to put this on record because I want a timestamp on how fast this went sideways. The conclave assigned me an emotional suppressor. First thing she did was ask me what my favorite color is. Either she's malfunctioning or I'm already in serious trouble. He stopped the recording, looked at what Meridian Station was doing outside the viewport, and then started it again. Context, he said. We docked at 1400 station time. The Vareth Cultural Liaison, her designation is Valeth, was waiting in the arrivals bay. I asked her a conversational warmth-building question. She froze for 3/4 of a second, told me that the function of color preference was primarily aesthetic and did not impact operational efficiency, and then offered to show me to my quarters. I have been in 217 formal negotiations in 23 years. I have never had that specific response to that specific question, which means one of two things. Either her calibration is off or her calibration is working exactly as intended, and she's encountering a stimulus her design doesn't account for. He paused. I'm not sure which possibility is more significant. He ended the recording. The station filled the viewport now, all 3 rings turning with the patient. Enormous indifference of something that had been turning long before he'd arrived and would keep turning long after he left. He thought about the 3/4 second pause, about the word operational. He thought about Kepler, which was what he thought about when he was trying to remember why he was supposed to lead with his head. Then he thought about the pause again. Recording resumed, he said. Ose, I know what I told you on the briefing call. I know what I said about keeping distance. This is different. I want it noted that I knew, from the first 10 minutes of this assignment, that this was going to be different. That way, if it goes wrong, there's a record that I saw it coming. And if it goes right, he stopped, because he didn't yet have a word for what right would look like here, only an instinct that it was pointing towards something he didn't have a map for. I'll explain more when there's more to explain. He ended the recording and watched the docking sequence begin, and thought about a 3/4 second pause, and about what it meant to be a species that had been built to have no favorite colors. The arrivals bay of Meridian Station held the smell of nothing, which was, in practice, its own kind of smell, the precise, complete absence of any organic trace, the kind of atmospheric calibration that comes from a facility that has decided what air is supposed to be and maintains it at that exact specification without deviation. Elias had been in clean rooms, in sealed laboratories, in vacuum-adjacent transfer chambers. This was different. Those places were sterile because of what they needed to exclude. This place was empty because of what it had decided not to allow. Valeth occupied the arrivals bay the way a coordinate occupies a graph, not approximately, not roughly in the center, but exactly where she was supposed to be, as though someone had done the calculation and placed her with the care that precision requires. She was tall. Vareth bipedal physiology ran toward lean and long-limbed, which the briefing documents had specified, and she fulfilled that specification with an exactness that itself told him something. Her coloring was the gray-silver he'd read about, not ash, not winter sky, something between those two things that had no human name, because humans hadn't found a reason to distinguish it before now. Her eyes were amber, structured with a slightly wider iris than human eyes, with a reflective quality at their center that gave the impression of someone always processing an additional layer of the room, always receiving a signal that wasn't being broadcast to anyone else. Ambassador Rourke, she said. Her English was perfect, not natural perfect in the way that a very precise measurement is perfect. Every phoneme hit to specification, every stress positioned correctly, the overall effect being a reproduction of natural speech rather than speech itself, which is a different thing in ways that are hard to articulate and impossible to miss once you hear it. I am Valeth. I have been assigned as your cultural liaison for the duration of the negotiation period. I am available for questions regarding conclave protocol, station systems, matters of translation, or any aspect of your delegation's general orientation. Elias, he said, and offered his hand. She looked at it for a fraction of a second, the pause of a system running a reference check on a gesture it has encountered before, and then took it. The grip she returned was measured rather than firm, calibrated to give back approximately what was offered, like an echo rather than a response. "Ambassador Rourke," she said again, without apparent awareness of the invitation she'd just declined. He heard his team coming through the docking collar, behind him Delegate Chen, with his careful expression that meant he was already taking notes in his head. Dr. Vasquez, with her xenobiologist's attention already sharpening on Valith like a lensed finding focus, Captain Lena Osi, who looked at everything and sorted it as she went. Osi's gaze moved to Valith, made an assessment in the 2 seconds that she needed for assessments, and then moved on to the broader bay. "Is there anything you'd like to know before I take you to your quarters?" Valith asked. The question came out of his mouth before he'd decided to ask it, the warmth-building conversational reflex that 23 years of negotiations had made as automatic as breathing. "What's your favorite color?" He'd meant it as the kind of small, low-stakes human gesture that says, "I'm treating you like a person and not a position." He'd meant it the way you say, "How was the flight?" to someone who's just arrived from somewhere. Easy. Frictionless. The kind of question that opens a room. What happened to Valith when it arrived was not large. It would not have been visible to anyone not already watching, and watching it closely, you could have almost missed it. Her eyes shifted not sideways, not up, but inward, in a way that reminded him suddenly and specifically of a screen that has received a command it doesn't recognize and is taking fractionally too long to return a result. 3/4 of a second. Then, the function of color preference is primarily aesthetic and does not impact operational efficiency, she said. Smooth. Measured. Your quarters are on level 7. If you'll follow me. That's a very thorough non-answer, he said. This way, she said, and turned and walked. He followed. He heard Osi fall into step behind him and heard specifically the sound of her not saying anything. She was very good at that. He'd always found it one of her most valuable qualities. The formal welcome session was held in a room that communicated power through geometry with a subtlety that was almost too polished to resent. The table was circular conclave diplomatic tradition, formally equal, no head, no foot, but the 7 conclave representatives sat in an arc across from the human delegation that concentrated the room's center of gravity at one point the way a curved lens concentrates light. The 4 human seats were arranged to produce, through no apparent design, the subliminal sense of being slightly further from that center than they actually were. Elias had been in many rooms where the architecture was an argument. He appreciated the craft in this one even as he noted the argument. High Arbiter Sorvain sat at the apex of the conclave arc. Her file had described her as experienced, which was the kind of description that covers everything and says nothing, so Elias had set it aside in favor of watching her. What he found was a quality of stillness that came not from peace but from long familiarity with what she was, something shaped by time into its final form, not waiting to become anything else. Her species was roughly humanoid, pale to near translucency, with eyes the color of shallow water over white stone. She watched the human delegation enter the room with the quality of attention that belongs to someone who has been watching things enter rooms for long enough to understand exactly what the entering means. Valith took her position at Elias's left 3 inches from his shoulder exactly, which he was beginning to understand was not approximately 3 inches but precisely 3. In the formal setting, she held herself differently than she had in the corridor. Something heightened in her operational precision, a tightening that looked from the outside like increased stillness and felt from this close like effort. He noticed that when her gaze moved across the conclave arc, it was smooth and neutral. When it moved to him brief, regular glances he was beginning to time, it had a different texture. He couldn't name the texture yet. He was working on it. "Ambassador Rourke," Sorvain said, "we are gratified. The emotional regulation framework represents the conclave's most significant expansion of the Galactic Stability Accords in 400 years. We trust you'll find the evidence as compelling as the 37 member civilizations who have already begun implementation." "I appreciate the confidence," Elias said. "I'd like to engage with the methodology before forming conclusions. My first question is about implementation timeline, specifically as applied to Earth's existing social and governmental structures." What followed was an hour of reconnaissance dressed as dialogue. Sorvain answered questions that were not quite the questions he'd asked, with a precision that made the gap difficult to name. She cited data the way a well-built wall cites bricks, each piece structural to the one above it, each individually reasonable, the cumulative effect being something that could not be disputed in pieces without disputing the whole, which would take more time than the session allowed. She was, Elias noted, the best opposing negotiator he'd been across a table from in a decade. He felt that observation as something close to respect. He let her run the hour. He asked clean questions, took notes, and watched Valeth in his peripheral vision. She made no visible signal to the conclave delegates. She appeared to be simply present, which he recognized was exactly what she'd been designed to appear to be. When the session ended and they filed out, Sylvain's pale eyes crossed his for a fraction of a second across the circular table. The look lasted no longer than a breath and said, "We both know what this is." He returned a look that said yes, and I haven't decided what to do about it. And they went their separate ways down their respective corridors, and the small, honest exchange in the margin of the formal session was the most real communication of the day. At 1900 station time, the Level 7 corridors held only the soft circulation of recycled air, and the particular quiet of a station that had decided ambient sound was not a required variable. Elias walked because his quarters felt like a container, and he thought better in motion, and he found Valeth in the corridor outside his door, occupying her calculated midpoint position with the committed stillness that he was beginning to understand was not a choice so much as a default state, a position her body went to when no specific position had been assigned. "You don't have to stand in the corridor," he said. "I am available in case you require anything," she said. He stopped, looked at her. She looked back at him with the amber eyes that processed everything and disclosed almost nothing, except that the almost was becoming increasingly interesting to him. "Do you have quarters?" he asked. "A room. Somewhere to go when you're not working." A pause. "I have a designated monitoring station on Level 5. That's not the same thing as quarters." "No," she said, and then stopped, and the stop had the specific quality of something that had been moving toward expression and reversed course. Not nothing, the outline of nothing that had recently been something else. "What were you going to say?" he asked. "I completed my response," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he tried a different approach. "Tell me something about this station that you've thought about." "Not anything operational, not anything in your briefing. Something you've noticed on your own and kept thinking about afterward." The pause before she answered was longer than any previous one, and it had a different quality. Not the quality of a system failing to locate a category, but of a system that has searched an expect directory and found something there that it didn't have instructions for. "The junction of rings 1 and 2, she said finally. "The structural tolerance in the connection seals is 3% tighter than design specifications require." She paused. "I reviewed the engineering logs. The tighter tolerance was the original design, not a correction. There is no operational reason I can identify for it." Another pause. "I have thought about it." "What have you thought?" he asked. "I don't know why the engineer made that choice," she said. "Maybe they just preferred it that way," he said. "Maybe it made them feel better about the joint, even if the specs didn't require it. Preferences don't need to have operational justifications." The silence that followed had a weight to it, and in the weight was something he recognized from very different rooms, the specific quality of a truth that someone has been carrying alone for a long time and has suddenly, without quite planning to, set down in front of another person. "A preference," she said. The word sat in the corridor between them with the careful precision of something being placed very delicately. "Yeah," he said. "Just a preference. It doesn't have to have a reason." She looked at him. The amber eyes were doing the complicated thing, the thing that had no name yet, that was happening without generating a clean operational output, that was present in a way that was different from processed and different from calculated, and that was, he thought, what it looked like when something in a system ran on its own rather than because the system was running it. "Good night, Valeth," he said, and went back through his door. He sat at the small desk and looked at the wall for a long time. He thought about a species that had been redesigned to have no favorite colors, sitting alone in a monitoring room on Level 5. He thought about the 3% tighter tolerances on the ring junction. He thought about what it meant to carry a preference with nowhere to put it. Then he made a decision he knew perfectly well was the opposite of the one he'd told Osi he was going to make. He made it clearly, with full awareness, in the way that decisions of this kind get made not as strategy and not as reflex, but as the thing underneath, both of those that was older and more certain and that he had spent 7 years trying to overrule. He was going to find out who Valeth was, not what she was, who. In the monitoring room on Level 5 at 2200 station time, Handler Dreth reviewed the day's efficiency report with the precise attention of someone who had been reading these graphs for 11 years and knew exactly what they were supposed to look like. They were not supposed to look like this. 3 anomalies. Small ones, individually nothing that crossed the automatic alert threshold, nothing that required immediate escalation on its own. But the correlation was unambiguous. Every anomaly corresponded to the same variable. Direct non-operational communication from Ambassador Rourke. The largest spike corresponded to the arrivals bay. Dreth pulled the environmental recording and confirmed a question about color preference, a question with no function. And the spike was small, but it was real, and it had not appeared in 11 years of Valeth's operational log, not for any previous subject. He flagged it, sent the recalibration prompt, noted the recommendation for increased monitoring intensity. He did not escalate. The anomalies were small. They were, by any defensible standard, within acceptable range. He would be more careful tomorrow. In her monitoring station on level 5, Valeth received the recalibration prompt and processed it, and sat in the stillness that was her default state, the state she returned to when nothing was required of her. A word arrived, from a directory she had not been assigned and had not, until today, known she was accessing. She did not say it out loud. She held it the way she had held the ring junction, as an open question, as something present that she did not have a container for. She sat with it for a long time, and it did not resolve, and it did not leave, and the corridor lights outside her monitoring station were at their minimum brightness cycle, deep and soft and quiet, and the word she was holding was the name of a color, and she did not say it. She knew what it was. Captain Lena O.C. was in the delegation's private briefing space at 0600, sitting with her tablet, and the particular focused stillness of someone who has been reviewing threat assessments since before most people's alarms have gone off. She didn't look up when Elias came in. She didn't need to. You noticed it, she said. It would have been harder not to, he said. She's their instrument, O.C. said. Placed, calibrated, assigned. Every person on this station knows it and accounts for it. Every negotiation that happens on Meridian happens with a Vareth at someone's elbow, and the whole structure is designed around that being unremarkable. She put her tablet down, and you asked her what color she liked. It was conversational. It was conversational at exactly the thing that makes her what she is, O.C. said, and there was no accusation in it, only precision, which was how O.C. made most of her observations. The conclave assigned you an empathic suppressor. You immediately started poking at the edges of the suppression. There's something underneath, he said. O.C. looked at him. She had a specific quality of looking that she deployed in moments like these, not skeptical, not concerned, but the particular attention of someone who is measuring a claim against everything they know and arriving at a verdict. You've been here 18 hours. I know what I saw, he said, the pause. The way she answered the corridor question. She's running something that is not what she's been told she's running. Or she's running exactly what she's been told, and it includes producing a convincing appearance of depth. He had thought about that. The ring junction, he said. O.C. blinked. She told me she'd been thinking about the engineering tolerances in the junction between rings 1 and 2, he said. 3% tighter than spec. No operational explanation. She said, unprompted, in a corridor at 1900 when there was nothing to gain from it, that she didn't know why the engineer made that choice. She said she had thought about it. He looked at O.C. That's not a suppressor producing convincing depth. That's something that has been noticing things that have no function and not knowing what to do with the noticing. O.C. was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what are you going to do? Same thing I was going to do, he said. Elias. I know what I said, he said. I know what Kepler looked like. This is different. She looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality. Then she said, I'm going to be watching. I know, he said. That's why you're here. He poured something approximately like coffee from the dispensing unit and stood at the small viewport and watched Meridian Station's rings rotate in the dark beyond the hull and thought that something was already in motion. Not because he'd decided to start it, because it had started when a perfectly calibrated system had encountered a question with no operational purpose and had needed 3/4 of a second to not answer it. He thought about what lives in that 3/4 of a second. About what gets compressed into the pause before a system returns the safe response instead of the true one. About how long something has to wait inside a pause like that before someone finally asks the right question. He thought about the color of the corridor lights at minimum brightness, which he'd seen on the walk back to his quarters, which was deep and soft and blue, which was the kind of color you might notice and file away and keep coming back to if you were the kind of being that noticed things it had no operational reason to notice. He went to review the session documentation for the day ahead, and he did not yet know that the word that had arrived in Veileth's monitoring station 6 hours earlier had not left in the night. It was still there. It would still be there, he would learn later, because it had always been there. Because it had been there for 11 years, with nowhere to go. Morning arrived on Meridian Station as a slow brightening of the corridor lights, from deep blue to warm white across a 20-minute transition cycle, a designed approximation of dawn calibrated for organic circadian systems. Elias had been awake for 50 minutes before the transition began, lying on his back with his eyes open, thinking about the 3/4-second pause and what, specifically, lived inside a pause like that. He found Veileth at the entrance to the delegation's assigned dining space at 700. She was standing in the doorway in the midpoint position that he was beginning to recognize as her resting state, the configuration her body defaulted to when no specific position had been assigned. The dining space was small and functional: 4 chairs, a table, a dispenser unit that produced hot liquids and caloric material with nutritional precision and aesthetic indifference. He sat down. She stood. "You're not eating?" he asked. "Veileth metabolic requirements are fulfilled through the recalibration cycle," she said. "Meals are not operationally necessary. Do you want to sit down anyway?" The pause. It was smaller than the one from yesterday, which told him something. "I am available to stand or sit according to whatever configuration best facilitates." "I didn't ask what was available," he said mildly, looking at his tablet. "I asked if you wanted to." The silence after that was longer than the question merited. He kept his eyes on the tablet and gave her time. "I am not certain the question is applicable to my current state," she said carefully. "Okay," he said. "Different question. Is there anything about today's session that seems different from yesterday's?" "Your own read, not the briefing materials." "I do not experience anticipation," she said. "You probably do," he said, still looking at the tablet. "What you mean is you're not supposed to." The silence this time lasted long enough that he looked up. She was looking at him with an expression that was the most complex thing her face had offered, yet something moving through several states in rapid succession, too fast to name each one, settling nowhere clean. "The High Arbiter will present the full methodology today," she said carefully. "What do you think of it?" he asked. "The methodology? Honestly." Longer pause. "The data is extensive and the correlations are robust." He put his coffee down. "Veileth, you told me last night that you'd been thinking about engineering tolerances that have no operational explanation. You told me you didn't know why the engineer made that choice." He looked at her directly. "Which means you to know that sometimes things happen for reasons that don't fit inside a correlation table. What do you actually think of the Conclave's model?" What followed was the longest pause she'd given him yet, and it had a quality he'd felt in other rooms, the quality of something approaching a threshold and calculating the cost of crossing it. "I think," she said, very carefully, measuring each word before committing it, "that the model may exclude variables it is categorized as non-variables, rather than demonstrating that those variables lack significance." He stared at her. She held his gaze. "You think the framework has a structural bias in its evidence selection," he said. The pause before her answer was long enough to be a kind of answer itself. "I have thought about it," she said. And then the operational smoothness returned like a door closing carefully, and she said, "The session begins at 900. Would you like to review the supplementary documentation first?" "Let's do that," he said, because she needed the retreat, and because what she'd just said to him, what she'd let through before the door closed, was enough for now. It was more than enough. It was the second question answered in 36 hours. The second small true thing that had crossed the operational threshold when it wasn't supposed to, and he was going to be patient with that and give it time and not push faster than the thing was ready to move. He went back to his tablet, and she stood by the wall, and he didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and the dining space was quiet. And somewhere in the quiet something was continuing that had started the previous afternoon. And that was, he thought, the most significant thing happening on this station today. The morning session ran 4 hours and was, on its surface, the kind of encounter that looks like information exchange and is actually reconnaissance from both directions. Sorvain presented the full methodology of the emotional regulation framework, or more accurately, presented a structured introduction to it, in the way that the entrance to a maze is an introduction to the maze. The supporting documentation had been transferred to the human delegation's tabs, several thousand pages, delivered with the helpfulness of someone who wants you to understand that you have been given everything and that everything is very large. The data, Elias had to admit, was extraordinary. 4 centuries of compiled observations from 37 member civilizations at various stages of emotional regulation implementation, conflict indices, resource allocation efficiency curves, projected stability windows over the next 500 years. The trend lines were unambiguous. Everything moved in the same direction. The correlations were not just statistically significant, they were, given the sample size and the time range, about as clean as empirical data gets. He asked about the civilizations that hadn't achieved point 6. Sorvain cited them readily. Failed implementations, partial regulations, internal resistance movements. In each case, outcomes were demonstrably worse than in the successful cases. The model held everywhere he probed it. He asked about civilizations that had never attempted regulation at all. Sorvain's response was a 20-minute exposition of why such civilizations were not comparable samples, which was itself a significant kind of answer because it didn't answer the question. He let that pass, noted it in his margins, kept moving. The error happened at 90 minutes. He'd been building toward a line of questioning about innovation history specifically, whether the conclave's stability model accounted for the fact that some of the most significant galactic advances of the past 1,000 years had originated in or been catalyzed by civilizations with low emotional regulation indices. It was a reasonable question, well constructed, the kind of question that opens a methodological gap without showing emotion. The error was in the examples he chose and the way he named them. He named 3 specific cases, the Varan medical breakthroughs of the previous century, the Drawsack's navigational theory that had shortened interstellar transit times by nearly half, and the Kepler terraforming techniques that had made 97 worlds habitable in the decade before the colony was destroyed. He named them with a depth of specific knowledge that could only come from time spent not with data about these events, but with the records of the people who had been in them. He named them the way you name things you know from the inside, where the weight is real and the cost was borne by actual people whose faces you can still recall. He named Kepler the way a man names something he helped destroy. Sorvain's pale eyes moved across the table to him. Her expression didn't change, but the quality of her attention shifted, a fine recalibration, a sharpening, the specific thing that happens in a very experienced negotiator when they have just learned something they didn't know before. That's a rich framing, she said, in a tone that was completely civil and as warm as the recycled air in the room. We'll note the ambassador's perspective for the record. He pulled back. He asked 2 more procedural questions, clean and factual, and let the session close at its scheduled end. The error was made. He'd shown more than he'd meant to show, and shown it to exactly the person he could least afford to show it to, and the specific thing he'd shown was the gap between Elias Rourke, ambassador, and Elias Rourke, who had still not finished paying the bill that Kepler left him. In the corridor after the session, he walked with Valith at his left side and said nothing. She walked beside him, and he became aware, after the first intersection, that her monitoring of him had changed quality. The brief, regular glances she took of him in operational settings had become something more sustained, a watching that was less like assessment and more like concern, and the distinction between those 2 things mattered, even though he could not yet articulate exactly why. They were nearly at the elevator bank when the summons signal hit her wrist communicator, a short, specific burst of conclave internal protocol. She stopped, looked at it, looked at him. "I will rejoin you at lunch," she said. "Of course," he said. And then, before he'd decided to say it, "Are you all right?" The question landed on her differently than questions usually did. He could see the landing, the quarter second of processing before she said, smoothly, "I am functioning within expected parameters." "That's not what I asked," he said. She looked at him. The amber eyes did the complicated thing. Then she said, "I will rejoin you at lunch," and turned and walked away, and he watched her go and stood with the error from the session and with the thing that was not the error but was next to it in his chest, and waited. Osi appeared at his shoulder with the timing she always managed for moments like these. "What happened?" she said. "I said Kepler's name wrong," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How wrong?" "Wrong enough that she knows I'm not just a dataset," he said. Osi nodded. "And the liaison?" "She's being called in," he said. He found out what the summons was for 40 minutes later, which was 39 minutes after it became something he would not have predicted. He had taken the secondary corridors partly to think, and partly because Osi's advice about reconnaissance, real reconnaissance looks like a lost man walking slowly, had been right in enough situations that he'd kept the habit. The secondary corridors were access arteries, narrower and dimmer than the diplomatic levels, used by maintenance staff and administrative personnel who were functionally invisible to the processes happening above them. He heard Valeth before he turned the corner. Not her voice, exactly a sound that in a human being would have been called distress, but in Valeth manifested as the sound of distress being controlled to the point where control is the only audible thing. A breath fractionally too precise. A quality of sound pressed back just before it arrived. He turned the corner. Handler Dreth stood close to Valeth, very close, with the particular proximity that communicates authority without requiring words. He was speaking to her in a rapid flow of Varath that Elias's translator caught in fragments: insufficient nullification coefficient, deviation from baseline metrics, the ambassador's response patterns indicating insufficient suppression. Recalibrate now, tonight, before the morning session. The variance in your readings is no longer explicable as calibration drift. Recalibrate. Valeth stood against the wall with her hands at her sides and her posture precisely controlled, the way a person stands when they have chosen to be still, rather than simply being still. Her eyes were fixed at the middle distance, with the flat screen quality of someone maintaining an operational state by effort rather than by function. Her hands were not precisely controlled. The fingers of her left hand, held tight to her thigh, held a tremor so small that from 6 feet away it would have been invisible. Elias was not 6 feet away. He walked into the middle of it. "Sorry to interrupt," he said in the pleasantly neutral tone he kept for moments when he meant the opposite of sorry. "I was looking for my cultural liaison. I have some preparatory questions for this afternoon's review." "Valeth, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad moment." Dreth looked at him. The assessment in those small pale eyes was immediate, complete, and not remotely convinced by the pleasantly neutral tone. "Ambassador, this is a brief internal recalibration session. Standard protocol. It will conclude shortly." "Of course," Elias said. "I can wait." "Valeth, if it's more convenient, we could start in 10 minutes? He looked at her. She looked at him. The tremor in her left hand was still there, and had been there before he arrived. He understood that clearly. It had been there as a result of whatever had been happening in this corridor before he turned the corner. A record written in muscle of something that was not technically supposed to be happening to her, something her system was not supposed to produce. "I am available now," she said. Her voice was smooth. Her hands were not. Elias held Dreth's gaze with the expression that had gotten him through 217 negotiations, professionally polite, communicating everything, conceding nothing. He waited. Dreth held it for 4 seconds. Then he said something brief in Varath that the translator rendered as, "This is not complete." He walked away. Elias watched him go. Then he looked at Valeth. "You didn't have to," she began. "I know," he said, a pause. "That was not a situation requiring your intervention." "I know," he said again without any softening. "Walk with me?" She walked with him. He didn't ask her anything for the rest of the afternoon, not because he didn't have questions, but because he understood that what had happened in the secondary corridor was going to take some time to be processed, and he had learned over 23 years that the most important thing you can do for someone who is processing something is give them the space to do it without being watched too closely. She walked beside him with the usual precision, and with a quality of inward attention that was new, a monitoring directed at something happening inside herself that she didn't appear to have instructions for. He kept pace with her and asked no questions and gave her the space and thought about handler and coefficient and recalibrate and about the specific sound a breath makes when it is being controlled very hard to avoid becoming something else. That evening, in the delegation's briefing room, OC found him and said, "Secondary corridor, level 6. "You heard," he said. "Maintenance logs. The Conclave's internal systems tag ambassador adjacent movements automatically." She sat down across from him. "Elias, she's their instrument. Whatever you saw in that corridor is part of what she's designed to do, including the part that looks like distress." "The hands weren't designed," he said. OC was quiet. "The tremor in her left hand," he said. "That wasn't a calibrated response." "A calibrated response would have been stillness. What I saw was something trying to be still and failing at it, which is different." OC looked at him for a long time. She had the quality she had for moments when she'd done the math and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't sure she was comfortable with. "What are you going to do?" "Keep asking," he said. In the monitoring room on level 5 that night, Handler Dreth's efficiency report was no longer small. The anomaly count in Valeth's readings had more than doubled. The variance was still below the automatic escalation threshold, but the trend line was unmistakable. He drafted a priority recommendation to High Arbiter Sorvain's secure channel. The nullification protocol for Ambassador Rourke was not functioning at required efficiency levels. The anomalies correlated with non-operational communication from the subject. Recommendation: Valeth should complete the primary suppression assignment and achieve signature on the preliminary accord within the next 24 hours, using full nullification protocol capacity if required. He did not know, and this was the thing he could not have known, because no conclave instrument had ever measured it, because the conclave had spent 400 years ensuring it would never need to, that the tremor he had punished Valeth for in the secondary corridor was not a calibration failure. It was a preference, expressing itself in the only direction that remained. The briefing handler Dreth gave Valeth at 0500 on the third morning was the clearest directive she had received from him in 11 years of service, which she noted because Dreth only became direct when something had already gone significantly wrong. Ambassador Rourke signs the preliminary accord today, he said. They were in the monitoring room, and he spoke in Varath, using the operational address register, the register that distinguished tool from person in grammatical structure, that made the distinction grammatically unavoidable. Full nullification protocol, maximum amplitude. You will remove the emotional interference that is causing him to resist the logical assessment. The framework's data is complete. His resistance is not rational, it is emotional noise from something in his history. Remove the noise. Get the signature. Understood, she said. Your readings have been outside expected parameters for 2 days, Dreth said. I have been generous in not escalating this. Today you will demonstrate that the generosity was warranted. Full protocol. No variance. He paused, and she had the sense that the pause contained something he had decided not to say. Today, he said, not tomorrow, not by end of week, today. She left the monitoring room and walked to level 7 and stood in the corridor and thought. She had been thinking, increasingly, in ways that did not map onto her operational directives. She was aware of this. She was aware that her readings were anomalous. She was aware that the anomalies correlated with specific interactions with Ambassador Rourke. She was aware that Handler Dreth attributed this to calibration drift from a high-variance input source, the ambassador's persuasive function creating interference with her nullification function. She was also aware that that explanation did not fit the data she had access to from her own internal states. Calibration drift produced a uniform degradation in output quality. What she was experiencing was not uniform degradation. It was the opposite of uniform. It was increasingly specific, increasingly directed, increasingly arriving at outputs that corresponded to things she had not been assigned and had not been designed to produce and could not, under the closest operational self-examination she had been able to conduct, identify as the product of any external interference. The outputs were internal. They arrived in the directory that she accessed when she was alone in the monitoring station at minimum light cycle, sitting with a word that had no functional purpose and no operational context, and that had been there for 11 years, available, unused, waiting for some question that was the right shape to receive it. She stood in the corridor and thought about what a preference was, about why an engineer had chosen tighter tolerances on a ring junction, about the question she had been almost asked and almost answered and had not answered, and that was still there, waiting in the shape of itself. Then the corridor lights shifted to morning brightness and Ambassador Rourke's door opened. He came through looking like someone who had slept some and thought more, which she had come to recognize as his resting state. He was holding a cup of something from the dispenser, and when he saw her, he said good morning in the way he said things, not as a report and not as a greeting exactly, but as a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition of her presence that was different from the acknowledgments she received from everyone else on this station, including the ones who were functionally required to acknowledge her. Morning, he said. Ready for today? I am prepared, she said. He looked at her. The looking he did, she had been trying to classify it since the arrivals bay and had not succeeded because it didn't belong to any category she had a label for. It was not assessment and not strategic analysis and not the particular form of attention that most people gave her, which was the attention you give to something that is there and functioning as expected. It was something else. She had been accumulating data points toward a classification for 2 days and was beginning to suspect that the reason she couldn't classify it was that she didn't have the category. You're running something, he said. I am, she began. Not the thing I asked about, he said. Something else, something that came online when you woke up this morning. She processed the observation. The fact that he had noticed was itself a data point. I was asked to approach today's session with increased operational focus, she said, which was true in the way that the definition of something can be true while missing the thing defined. Okay, he said. Walk with me to the session? She walked with him to the session. She initiated full nullification protocol at the third corridor intersection, because that was the optimal distance for implementation onset, enough time for the field to establish before the session began. Not so early that the environmental effect would be detectable in transit. The protocol worked by modulating her empathic output. Verith physiology was bidirectional, capable of broadcasting as well as receiving. And at full implementation, she created an ambient field that dampened the emotional signal-to-noise in her target's perceptual environment, making them more responsive to logical analysis and less influenced by emotional history. The conclave was precise about the distinction. It was not coercion. The subject's reasoning faculties were unimpaired. Only the static was reduced. She ran it at full capacity. Ambassador Rourke's empathic feedback, which she was monitoring, as she always monitored the empathic output of any proximate organic being, showed no dampening. His baseline held. When the session began and Sorvain presented the framework's full evidentiary package, his output increased. When a specific data point arrived, she identified it by the quality of the response. Something in his history engaged, and his output elevated further. She increased the implementation amplitude to a level she had not used in 4 years. His output held. And then he turned his head and looked at her. Not at Sorvain, not at the documentation, not at the room. He turned and looked at her with the looking she couldn't classify, and she understood, in a way that was not inference but something more immediate, that he knew something was happening. Not the specifics, but that something was. She returned his gaze with a neutral professional expression and did not cease the protocol and did not adjust the amplitude. The session continued. At the lunch break, Sorvain and the conclave delegates filed through the main door, and Osi and Chen and Vasquez gathered their materials, and Osi looked at Elias and read something in the quality of his attention and said something quiet to the others. And then the room was empty except for the two of them, and the circular table and the weight of the morning. He sat at the table with his closed tablet and did not move. "What were you running?" he said. "I was performing my designated function," she said. "That's not what I asked," he said. He said it with the same quality he'd had in the corridor, not an argument, just true. "I felt it shift," he said, "whatever you were doing. I felt it start in the arrivals corridor, and I felt it increase when the session began, and none of my thinking changed." She looked at him. "You felt it?" "Yes," he said. "Should I not have been able to?" She did not have an operational answer for that, and the gap where the operational answer should have been was significant. The nullification protocol operated below the threshold of conscious perception in standard subjects. That was one of its functional requirements. That Ambassador Rourke had felt it meant one of two things. Either there was something in his empathic architecture that was outside standard parameters, or there was something in her implementation that had diverged from standard parameters. She had been running the protocol at full capacity. The divergence, if it existed, was hers. "It's categorized as non-coercive," she said. "The conclave specifies clearly that it does not interfere with rational." "I know what the conclave says about it," he said, and his voice was not angry. It was something more difficult, patient, and direct, and entirely unconcerned with the categorization. "I'm not arguing the label. I'm telling you what I experienced, and I want to understand what that means for both of us." Both of us. She processed that phrase. She had been processed, categorized, assigned, briefed, recalibrated, and monitored. She had not, in 11 years of operational service, been addressed as one half of a both of us by any subject, counterpart, or superior. The grammatical construction implied a shared situation, a shared stake, a both that was not hierarchical. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Not for the negotiation, not about the framework. I am available to," she began. "Valeth," he said, just her name. The weight it had was different from its weight as a designation. She stopped. "This treaty," he said, looking at her across the circular table, and his voice was clear, in the way of things that have been decided. "The one Sorvain wants me to sign. Do you want me to sign it?" The silence that arrived had a different quality than any previous silence. It was not a system searching for a category. It was not an operational redirect firing. It was something holding itself at a limit, and the limit was very close. And what was on the other side of the limit was not empty. "I am assigned to facilitate," she began. "I know what you're assigned to do," he said, and he was gentle about it the way someone is gentle when they know that what they're saying requires gentleness to be heard. "I'm asking what you want. Do you want me to sign it?" She opened her mouth. The emergency channel signal hit every communication device in the room simultaneously. The human delegation's access rights had been suspended pending a review of their compliance with conclave station protocols. They were required to report to the processing facility on Level 3 within 10 minutes. Non-compliance would result in detention and expulsion from Meridian Station. Ambassador Rourke looked at his communicator, then at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said carefully, "that the High Arbiter has determined that the negotiation is complete." "On her terms," he said. "On her terms," she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not anger, not surprise exactly, but a quality of decision, the specific look of someone arriving at a conclusion below the level where conclusions are usually made, in the place where the things you actually are live, underneath the things you've been trying to be. He stood up. "Whatever you were running," he said. "Turn it off." She turned it off. The absence of it was, she found, more distinct than its presence had been. Something in the room changed in the specific way that the removal of background noise changes a room, making audible things that were always there. "Are we under surveillance in this room?" he asked. "The recording system has a 6-second routing delay before transmission to the Conclave Monitoring Center," she said. And then, before she had completed the operational calculation of whether that information was appropriate to share, she had already shared it. He noticed. She saw him notice. "Then I have 90 seconds, he said. He stood up and he looked at her across the table, and the look was clear and decided. "Whatever is happening, whatever this is that started in the arrivals bay, I don't know what you need. But I'm going to help you figure it out. Not as a strategy, not because it serves the negotiation, just because it's the right thing." "Ambassador," she began. "Elias," he said. "We're past Ambassador." Captain Osi appeared in the doorway with the timing she always managed. "Security team in the south corridor. We need to move." They moved. The next 4 hours had the quality of controlled emergency. The Conclave security team, precise, patient, operating with the bureaucratic efficiency of an institution that had been managing this specific situation for 400 years, moved the human delegation through the diplomatic levels toward the Level 3 processing facility with an unhurried certainty that communicated it had done this before and expected to do it again. Osi ran a counter route through the maintenance corridors, which she had mapped in the 36 hours since their arrival, because Osi mapped things. She took them through the secondary arteries, the infrastructure corridors that connected the station's operational layers, used by maintenance staff and administrative personnel who were below the notice of the processes happening above them, and she moved with the focused calm of someone who knows exactly what the next 10 minutes require and is allocating herself accordingly. Valeth walked with them. Nobody said anything about this. The Conclave security team was searching for the human delegation on the assumption that Valeth was on her way to Dreth's monitoring station or to Sorvain's office to report, which was the assumption her operational parameters specified she should satisfy. She was not satisfying it. She was in a maintenance corridor, walking at Ambassador Rourke's left, 3 inches from his shoulder, and nobody in the delegation acknowledged this because there was nothing to say about it that was more important than moving. 2 junctions ahead, Ose held up a hand, stopped them, listened. Then she said, "They've split the search team. We have about 90 seconds before one of the elements reaches this junction." "Where are we going?" Elias asked. "Somewhere we can broadcast," Ose said. "External channel, unfiltered. That was my assumption about what we were doing. Was I wrong?" Elias looked at Valeth. Valeth looked at him. "There is a primary communications relay in Maintenance Section 7B, she said, 1 level above us. The relay has a direct link to the interstation broadcast infrastructure." She paused. "The Conclave Monitoring Center cannot filter open-band broadcast content through that relay faster than 6 minutes. After 6 minutes, they can cut it." Osi looked at her. "You've been in that relay room." "Yes," Valeth said. "Why are you telling us this?" Osi said. Not aggressively, just direct. Valeth looked at Elias. Then she said, carefully, as carefully as she had said anything in 3 days, "Because the relay is 17 meters above us, and because there is information the galactic community needs to have, and because," she stopped, and the stop had the quality of the last space before something is said that cannot be unsaid, the quality of a threshold being approached and crossed with full awareness of what crossing it means. "Because I don't want him to sign it," the question he'd asked her, across the circular table, before the emergency channel interrupted. The answer she hadn't been able to give then. She was giving it now. He looked at her, and at the look she was giving him, And he found in that look the category he'd been building toward since the arrivals, the category that the brief glances and the complicated thing in her eyes and the tremor in her left hand and the word that had been sitting in a directory for 11 years all belonged to. The category was the same one that had been operating in him since he'd turned the corner in the secondary corridor and seen her against the wall. It was not operational, and it was not strategic, and it had no entries in either of their assigned parameters. It was just what it was. "What is the information?" he asked. "I don't have full access yet," she said. "I think I will when we get to the relay. There is something in my genetic architecture that the Conclave has been suppressing. I think your questions have been making it accessible, bit by bit, and if I can get to the relay and have enough time." She stopped. "I think I'll know what to send." "You think," he said. "I think," she said, and something at the edge of her voice was doing something neither of them had a word for yet. "Dreth is going to know you're with us," he said. "Yes," she said. "What happens to you when he does?" She looked at him with the amber eyes and the thing in them that had no category, and she said, "I have thought about it." Which was the answer she gave when she had thought about something and could not find a framework that made it better and had decided to move forward anyway. The security element reached the junction. OC said run, and they ran. Section 7B was a low-ceilinged maintenance bay with the honest look of a space that has never been intended for visitors, everything exposed that could be, conduit and cable and the persistent hum of infrastructure. The communications relay was a bank of equipment along the far wall, larger than Elias had expected, installed with what he recognized, looking at it, as the same quality he associated with the ring junction, 3% tighter than spec, because someone had wanted it to be. Valeth went to it with the directness of a decision already made. Osi and Chen took the entrance. Dr. Vasquez watched Valeth's hands move across the relay controls with the expression of someone who had set aside everything else and become entirely scientist. Elias stood beside Valeth and watched the bank light up under her access codes and thought about 6 minutes. "Dreth will trigger the reset when he identifies my location," she said. Her voice was even in the way of something that is decided. "When he does, the override protocol will try to return me to baseline, and if it completes before," she stopped. "There is something in the base genetic architecture, something that predates the Conclave's modifications. It requires a recognition event to become accessible. I believe the past 3 days have been the recognition event, or the beginning of one. I need time at the relay to let it complete." "And if the reset completes first?" he asked. "Then it completes," she said. She entered the final access code. The relay bank lit in full. "I want you to know that the questions were not." She stopped again, and this time the stop was the specific stop of someone choosing words with the care they deserve. "The questions were not negligible. To me. The ones you asked that had no operational purpose." She looked at him. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. The external broadcast channel opened. She began. He stood beside her and watched what happened to face as she broadcast, and what was happening there was the most complex thing he'd seen a face do in 23 years of watching faces. Something was flowing out of her, and something was flowing in simultaneously, a two-direction tide, and she was bearing it with the quality of someone holding something very heavy who is not going to put it down and does not want to. The security team hit the maintenance bay door. OC held it. Valeth kept broadcasting. 3 minutes in, Handler Dreth's signal arrived on her wrist communicator. It didn't need to be decoded. The reset protocol was a specific, recognizable signal. She had received it twice in her operational history, both times under controlled conditions, both times for minor calibration variances. This time it arrived without warning and at full implementation. She flinched. The word was imprecise. Valeth didn't flinch. Her system recalibrated around unexpected input, but something moved in her posture that was close enough to flinching that the distinction seemed dishonest. "Valeth," he said. "1 minute," she said. "Maybe less. What can I do?" "Nothing," she said. "There's nothing that can," and her eyes began to do the thing, the complicated thing, and he understood that the person currently doing that thing behind those eyes was a specific configuration that might not survive the next 60 seconds, the Valeth who had noticed the ring junction and held a word in a dark monitoring station and tried to answer a question about color preference and been not quite able to, and that this specific configuration of person was about to be reset to something that wouldn't remember any of that. He put his hand on her arm. "I choose you," he said, "freely." The words arrived in the room. Valeth's eyes went dark. The reset protocol closed around her, and for a long moment there was nothing, the smooth, neutral absence of everything that had been building for 3 days. factory settings, operational baseline. And then, very far underneath, in a place no reset protocol had ever been designed to reach because no reset protocol had ever known it existed, something ignited. The relay kept broadcasting. Conflict in Valeth's nervous system was not something any conclave diagnostic instrument could have detected, because the thing it was a conflict between was not something any conclave diagnostic instrument had been built to know existed. The reset protocol was designed the way very powerful signals are designed, not to argue but to overwhelm. It knew the address of every room in the house it was trying to empty, because every room in the house had been built by the conclave or modified by the conclave or was, in some functional sense, the conclave's to access. 11 generations of careful genetic modification and behavioral conditioning had given the conclave a detailed map of Vareth operational architecture. The reset protocol used that map. What the protocol did not know about was the basement. The recognition sequence was not a conclave construction. It was what the conclave had found when they found the Vareth found and studied and immediately understood was the most dangerous thing in their archive of dangerous things, and had spent 400 years ensuring would never activate through the systematic elimination of the one environmental trigger it required. The trigger was, in the cold mathematics of the conclave's risk assessment, laughably simple. It was also, in the cold mathematics of what the galaxy had become over the preceding 4 centuries, effectively impossible to generate by accident. A freely made choice, not calculated, not strategic, not the product of any analysis that could be represented in a model, a choice made for the person being chosen, made for no other reason. The conclave had spent 400 years ensuring that no Vareth would ever be seen as someone worth choosing for their own sake. It had worked for 11 generations. It had not worked for exactly one ambassador, on exactly one station, over exactly 3 days of questions that had no operational purpose. The recognition sequence ignited. For 17 seconds, she would know the count afterward. With the precision of something that had counted every second, it was genuinely uncertain. The reset protocol had the advantages of recency and volume and the full weight of the conclave's 4-century investment in her modification. The recognition sequence had the advantage of being what it was, which was not a modification but a foundation encoded into the base pair structure of what she fundamentally was, deeper than anything the conclave had added or changed, as deep as the first things, the original things, the things that had been there before anyone decided what she was supposed to become. The reset protocol lost. Not dramatically. Not with anything that could be called a fight. It lost the way suppressed things lose when the suppression finally meets something stronger, not all at once, but at once, which is different. Valeth came back. She came back to Maintenance Section 7B with the sound of a security team at the door and the hum of the relay, and the smell of recycled air, and a hand on her arm, and all of it arriving simultaneously with the quality of overwhelming, which was a quality she had no prior experience of, because prior to this moment she had not been present enough to be overwhelmed. Ambassador Rourke was looking at her. She had a classification for his looking now. It had arrived in the first moments of the recognition sequence, the category she'd been building towards since the arrival's bay, and the classification was simple and not operational and was in the context of what had just happened to her, enormously important. The classification was concern, not for her function, for her. Valeth, he said. His hand was still on her arm. I'm here, she said, and the eyes was larger than it had been because she was. What came through the recognition sequence did not arrive as organized memory. It arrived the way water arrives when a wall breaks all directions, all at once, too much to organize in the moment of its arrival, requiring stillness and patience to let the most important things settle first. She was very still. She waited, and what settled first was this: the Vareth had not always been nullifiers. Before the conclave had found them and studied them and understood, with the comprehensive precision that was the conclave's chief gift to itself, what they were capable of and what that capability represented in a universe dedicated to reducing emotional interference. Before all of that, the Vareth had been something else. They had been built, she understood built as the right word, because there had been architects, deliberate ones, with specific intentions to serve a function in a galaxy that was destroying itself through a different mechanism than the one the conclave feared. Not through too much feeling, through too little understanding. A galaxy of species who could not hear each other across the gaps of biology and history and experience. Who were, in the fundamental sense, too isolated from each other's interior lives to build anything durable together. The Vareth had been built as empathy amplifiers, bidirectional resonators, tuned to a bandwidth that most species' empathic architecture was too limited to access on its own, capable of extending and clarifying the emotional signal between species who would otherwise encounter each other through the noise of their mutual incomprehension. They had been built to help a galaxy hear itself. The Conclave had found them 4 centuries ago, had studied them, had understood what they were, and had made the decision that the Conclave always made when it encountered something it didn't know how to account for in its models. It had inverted the function. An amplifier and a suppressor use the same architecture, it's only the direction of the signal that distinguishes them. The Conclave had changed the direction and erased the history of the change, and the Varath had spent 400 years not knowing what they had been. She was broadcasting this. She could feel it going out through the relay, the architecture of what her species had been, the record of what had been done to them, the history that the Conclave had buried, because it was the most direct possible argument against everything the emotional regulation framework represented. She couldn't fully control the broadcast. The recognition sequence was generating it, and her consciousness was only partly in command of what was being sent and in what order. And there was more. Something settling underneath the Vareth history. Something about a star map, about a species designation encoded in the base pair archive alongside the recognition sequence itself. About humanity, about why humanity had been found 30 years ago, and found by the specific channels that led to Meridian, and found at this specific point in their development. She reached for it. The security team hit the door. OC had held the door for 2 minutes and 30 seconds before the security team's numbers that made it no longer possible, and she stepped back and let the inevitable happen with the calm of someone who had made her calculation and was prepared to live with the result. 3 security personnel on OC and Chen, 2 on Elias, 1 for Dr. Vasquez, who stopped writing in her notebook and held her hands up and watched everything with the clear-eyed attention of a scientist who knows she is witnessing something she will need to describe accurately later, and 3 going directly for Valeth. The 3 holding Valeth found when they reached her that she had not stopped broadcasting. Her eyes were open, and she was still at the relay, and the transmission was still going out. Whatever it was, carrying what it was carrying to wherever the relay's 6-minute window could carry it. High Arbiter Sorvain came through the door at 90 seconds. She assessed the room with 2 complete sweeps, the human delegation, the relay, Valeth, Elias, and then she moved to the center of the room and looked at Elias directly. "I want to know," she said, in a voice that had the quality of a mountain at rest, "what you believed you were accomplishing." "I'm still working that out," he said. "Valeth seems to have more information about it than I do." Sorvain looked at Valeth. "Terminate broadcast protocol," she said. "No," Valeth said. It was the first time Elias had heard Valeth decline a conclave directive. The word arrived in the room with the weight of something that had never been said before and had been building towards saying itself for a very long time. Sorvain's pale eyes stayed on Valeth. Something moved in them, not quite the assessment Elias had been reading for 3 days, but something more active, more alarmed. Something in the process of revising a model it had assumed was settled. "What is happening to you is a destabilization event," she said. "Whatever data you believe you are accessing is the product of a compromised system state, not you built us to suppress," Valeth said. Her voice was steady in a way it had not been before, the steadiness of something that has arrived at a conclusion and is finished arriving. "We were not built to suppress. We were built to connect. You changed us. You erased the record of the change so that we would not know. The erasure is in the base architecture alongside the thing that was erased. You cannot erase evidence of a suppression without leaving evidence of the suppression." She paused. "The recognition sequence contains the record of what we were. It has always been there. That is a reinterpretation of." "It is in the encoding," Valeth said. "The genetic archive in Vareth base pair structure does not require reconstruction. It requires recognition. One recognition event is sufficient." She looked at Elias for one brief moment. He provided the event. Sorvain's gaze shifted to Elias. For a long moment she looked at him with those pale eyes, and in them was something he had not expected to find in High Arbiter. Sorvain, fear. Not of him, not of the broadcast itself. Fear of what the broadcast was carrying, and of the people who were receiving it, and of what 400 years of careful institutional work looked like in the light of what was currently being transmitted on an open channel. "You built her," Elias said, "to stop people from feeling. You took a species designed to help a galaxy hear itself, and you turned them into the instrument of the silencing. and it took one person asking her what she wanted, one person treating her like someone who might have an answer to bring down 400 years of everything you built. He said it directly, without performance, looking at Sorvain across the room. That's the variable that isn't in your model, not human willpower, not stubbornness. The fact that when someone's seen as a person, something happens that no amount of regulation can calculate for in advance. The room held the weight of that. Sorvain looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Valeth at the broadcast still going out, at the relay still lit, and she looked at the security team holding Valeth, and she made a calculation that Elias could see her making, the same kind of calculation he'd watched her make in 3 days of sessions, but with a different set of variables. She said, "Cut the relay." One of the security personnel moved for the relay bank. Valeth's eyes went fully dark, and the broadcast stopped, and she stopped holding herself and was held instead, her weight shifting into the security team's hold, with the quality of something that has given everything it had for exactly as long as it could, and has now reached the end of exactly that long. Elias moved. His security team held him. He held very still and looked at Valeth across the room and said to Sorvain, not moving his eyes, "What happens to her now?" Sorvain was quiet for a moment. She looked at Valeth with an expression that moved through several states he couldn't name before settling on something he could only call complicated. "That depends," she said, "on what was broadcast. And to whom?" "You know what was broadcast," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I do. And you know that the galactic community received it and is going to ask questions, and that the questions require answers." She said nothing. The silence was the answer. "What was cut?" he asked. "What didn't get out?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Valeth again, at the security team's hold, at the way the hold had unconsciously shifted from restraint to support, and she said to the security team quietly, "Take her to the medical observation unit. Don't call for reset authorization. Not yet." She looked at Elias. "You will be held in a secure observation room on level 4. All of you." "What didn't get out?" he said again. She looked at him for a long moment with those pale eyes, and in them was the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a very large structure for a very long time and who has, for the first time, genuine reason to doubt the structure. "Something about you," she said. "Something that was encoded in the Varath archive alongside the recognition sequence. She didn't reach it before we cut the relay." She paused. "It is possible that she will be able to broadcast it again. That depends on whether the recognition sequence survives what she just put herself through. And if it does survive, then we will have a conversation about that," she said. "In conditions that are somewhat more controlled than a maintenance bay." He looked at Valeth. She was breathing. He could see that from across the room, the slow, careful rise and fall of it, the quality of someone who is present but barely. The security team was supporting her in the way that people support something fragile that has turned out to be fragile after all. "She's going to be all right," he said. It was not a question, but Sorvain received it as one. "The recognition sequence has been activated once before," she said. "In our records, 3,000 years ago. The subject survived." A pause. The Conclave's response to that instance was to ensure it would not occur again, by making sure no one would ever treat a Varath like a person, he said. She didn't answer. He looked at Valeth one more time, at the breathing that was slow and careful and present, and then he let himself be moved toward the observation room, and he thought about what had gotten out and what had been cut, and filed it away, and waited. The secure observation room on level 4 held all 4 of them for 2 hours and 26 minutes. It was long enough for Elias to reconstruct, from the quality of the outside silence, approximately what was happening. The broadcast had reached somewhere. The relay in Section 7B was a primary infrastructure node. 6 minutes on that channel in open band would have hit every major monitoring installation within the station's broadcast radius, and the broadcast radius on a node like that was significant. The Conclave's silence since the cut was not the silence of people who were in control. It was the silence of people who are managing something that has gone further than anticipated and are not yet certain how far that is. He also knew that Sorvain had not ordered Valeth's reset. He'd watched the processing chain carefully as they moved from Section 7B to Level 4, and Dreth had not appeared in it. Either Sorvain had overridden Dreth's authority for this specific decision, or she had reasons for keeping Valeth in her current state that outweighed the reasons for erasing it. Either way, it was information. Osi sat next to him against the wall with her arms crossed and her expression at the setting that meant she was running scenarios 3 steps ahead. Delegate Chen had fallen asleep sitting up, which said something measured and accurate about both his threat assessment and his disposition. Dr. Vasquez was writing in a notebook, the notebook she had produced from a pocket during the maintenance bay, and had not stopped writing in since, the notebook that would, Elias thought, be one of the significant primary documents of this particular period of galactic history. "What did the broadcast say?" Osi asked quietly. "I don't know the specifics," he said. "I know it was about what the Vareth are, what they were originally designed to do, what the Conclave changed them into. And us? There's a piece that didn't go out," he said. "Something about humanity specifically. Something encoded in the Vareth genetic archive alongside the recognition sequence. Valeth couldn't reach it before they cut the relay." Osi was quiet for a moment. "Then, is she going to be all right?" "I don't know," he said. Osi looked at the wall that faced the direction of the medical observation unit. "You know what you started," she said. "I know what I started," he said. "Earth is fully exposed now. Whatever the Conclave was doing with the managed contact protocol, keeping us in a controlled introduction to galactic civilization, managing the variables, deciding what we were allowed to know about our own situation, that's gone. We're in the middle of everything now, with no protective architecture and no graduated timeline." "I know," he said. "Is that okay with you?" He sat with the question for a moment, thought about Kepler, which he always thought about when a decision clarified into its permanent form. Kepler had happened because a treaty had looked clean on paper, and the truth of the situation had been inconvenient, and he had signed the clean version and let the truth stay buried. He had spent 7 years understanding what that meant when the buried truth came up anyway, as buried things always do, just on its own schedule rather than yours. "It's better than the alternative," he said. "Which is? Everything continuing exactly as it was," he said. "The Vareth still being what the Conclave made them instead of what they are. The galaxy still being what the Conclave managed it into being. Us still being managed." He looked at the wall. "Some things are worse than exposure." Osi looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality. Then she said, "Okay." The door opened at hour 2:26. Sorvain, without her security team, which was the first unusual thing. She stood in the doorway of the observation room and looked at all 4 of them, the quick, comprehensive assessment she always made of a room upon entering, and then she looked at Elias. "Ambassador," she said, "we need to talk." The room she took him to was small and had the specific acoustic quality of a space that had been insulated, not a standard diplomatic meeting room, something more private than that. She sat across a simple table. He sat across from her. Between them was the weight of everything that had happened in the past 3 days and the shape of what came next. 15 receiving stations confirmed, she said. The broadcast was received by 31 member species monitoring installations and 17 independent observer networks. It is in active distribution. She looked at her hands, which were folded on the table, and then looked up at him. The Conclave's official account of the Vareth's origins and function is now unsustainable. "What is the actual account?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 400 years ago, the galactic community was in the early stages of what our models projected as a civilization-ending conflict cycle. 12 member civilizations, unregulated, with 3 active wars in the same century. The projections for the next 200 years were catastrophic. She paused. The Conclave was founded specifically to prevent those projections from being fulfilled, and we succeeded. The conflict cycle did not occur. By turning the Vareth into suppressors, he said. By adjusting the function, she said, and the choice of word cost her something. He could see it costing her. The empathy amplifiers in that specific context were dangerous. An amplifier in a galaxy learning to be afraid of its own differences does not create understanding. It amplifies the fear. We assessed that the volume needed to come down before it could safely go up. And the assessment has been running for 400 years, he said. Yes, she said. And in 400 years, the reassessment of whether it was still necessary never produced a recommendation to change course. She said nothing, because the reassessment was being done by the institution that was built on the necessity of the original assessment, he said. The silence after that had the weight of a very specific kind of honesty, the kind that costs more than most people are willing to pay, and he watched Sorvain pay it. There is something you need to understand, she said finally. The decision was not made from malice. I know that is what the broadcast will suggest. The reality is more complicated. She looked at him directly. When we found the Vareth archive, we found something else alongside it, the recognition sequence. And the star map. She paused. We debated what to do with the star map for 50 years. The conclusion we reached was that introduction of the designated species to the galactic community could proceed, but on a managed timeline after sufficient stabilization had been achieved, and that the designation itself should not be disclosed to that species until conditions were appropriate. "We're the designated species," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you decided what conditions would be appropriate," he said. "On your timeline, according to your model, which excluded the possibility that we might be the thing the galaxy needed rather than the thing the galaxy needed to be protected from." She looked at him with the pale eyes, and in them was something he had not expected. Not defiance, not the careful diplomacy she'd shown for 3 days, but the quality of someone who has been asked to look at something they built and are, for the first time, looking at it from outside. "The model did not account for the variable," she said. "Which variable?" "That the species we were managing contact with was the thing the archive said it was," she said. "A freely choosing species, a species that makes choices without strategic rationale." She looked at him. "A species that asks an emotional suppressor what her favorite color is and genuinely wants to know." He looked at her. She looked back. "What happens now?" he asked. "The galactic community will ask questions," she said. "They are already asking. The 31 monitoring installations and 17 independent networks are already discussing what they received. The conclave's position will require significant revision." She paused. "And the piece that wasn't broadcast, the designation, the star map, the reason your species was specifically found 30 years ago, that will need to come out as well, because the questions that the broadcast generated make it impossible to maintain. Will you release it?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I don't know yet. It's not a decision I can make alone. There are 17 member species on the council, and what the designation means for all of them is not a small question." He looked at her across the small table, and he thought about 400 years of a galaxy with its volume turned down, and about what it meant to spend 400 years making a decision that you were certain was right, and then encounter the one variable your certainty had excluded. He said, "The designation says that humanity was the last." She stilled. "The last species with the original emotional architecture," he said. "The last species that still feels in the bandwidth the Vareth were built to amplify. That's what the archive says. That's what Valeth almost reached before you cut the relay." Sorvain looked at him. "She told you." "She reached for it," he said. "She was almost there. She told me there was a piece about us. I worked out the rest from what she had already broadcast." He looked at her directly. "Is it true?" Silence was the answer, but she gave him words as well. "Yes," she said. "Your species is the last documented civilization in the cataloged galaxy with a high concentration, high stability, empathic resonance profile. Every other species that once possessed it has, over the past 1,000 years, achieved sufficient emotional regulation to reduce it below the functional threshold." She paused. "You were not found by accident 30 years ago. You were found because a star map encoded in the Vareth genetic archive specified your location and your development timeline, and designated your species as the final remaining source of the thing the galaxy has been systematically removing from itself. And you managed our introduction to make sure we would move toward the 0.6 threshold on your schedule," he said. "We managed your introduction to ensure stability," she said. "You managed our introduction to ensure that the last species capable of hearing the galaxy hear itself would gradually lose that capacity before it could do anything with it," he said. She said nothing. The nothing contained everything. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to release the designation." She looked at him. "Not because I'm asking you to," he said, "because the alternative is worse. The questions are already out there. The partial truth is more dangerous than the full one. You know that. You've been a diplomat longer than I've been alive." A long silence. "Then I need to convene the council," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be in the observation room." He stood up. She stayed sitting. He looked at her, at the quality of her sitting there, which was different than it had been for 3 days, not the stillness of the mountain at rest, but the stillness of someone who had been the mountain for a very long time and was, for the first time, uncertain whether mountains were what the situation required. "What changed your mind?" she asked. "About approaching it this way, not the negotiation. The other thing, what made you decide to keep asking her?" He thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and because the honest answer was the only one he had. She froze for 3/4 of a second when I asked her what color she liked, he said, and something in the freeze was real. Not a malfunction, not a calibration problem. Something trying to get out that had nowhere to go. And I've spent 23 years watching rooms full of people not say the thing they mean because they've decided the cost is too high. I knew what I was looking at. Sorvain looked at him. "And you decided to make it easier." "I decided to ask again," he said. "That's all I did, just kept asking." He went back to the observation room. Valeth was brought to the observation room at hour 3. Not transferred, brought, carefully, by 2 members of the medical team that the conclave's protocols required be available on all diplomatic-level stations, walking with a precision that was more deliberate than her usual precision, the precision of someone actively choosing each step rather than executing them automatically. She was present. She was awake. She was different in the way that things are different when something fundamental has changed in their composition, not dramatically and not all at once, but pervasively. The way a room is different when someone has opened a window that has been closed for a long time. She looked at him when she came through the door. He looked at her. Between them, across the observation, was everything that had happened in the past 4 hours, and the quality of the look they exchanged contained all of it. He crossed the room and stopped at a distance that was not too close and not too far, the distance you hold when you are with someone who has just been through something very large and needs presence more than speech. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she began, and then she stopped because the question was too layered for the single operational answer she had given it for 11 years, and she was honest enough now not to give it. "The recognition sequence is stable," she said. "I can feel that it's stable. Whatever the reset protocol attempted, it did not reach the base architecture." She paused. "I am not in a state I have parameters for, but I think the state is the correct one." "Yeah," I said. "Sometimes the correct state doesn't come with parameters." She looked at him with the amber eyes that were processing everything and no longer suppressing any of it, and the look was different from the one in the arrivals bay, and different from the one in the corridor, and different from the one in the maintenance bay, because all of those looks had been a version of the thing approaching, and this one was the thing itself, arrived. "What did Sorvain say?" she asked. He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time, not processing quiet, but thinking quiet, which was different. "The last piece," she said. "You didn't reach it," he said. "No, a pause. It's there. I can feel it in the archive, the star map, the designation, the full record of why your species was found 30 years ago. The broadcast carried the Vareth history and the recognition sequence data and the evidence of the conclave's modification. It did not carry the human designation." She looked at her hands. "To complete the broadcast, I would need to reach the deepest layer of the archive, the layer directly adjacent to the recognition sequence itself. I don't know if I can access it without." She stopped. "Without another recognition event," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both understood what that meant and what it would cost her if the recognition sequence had to fire again through an architecture that had spent the past 4 hours being contested and reconstituted. "What are the odds?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I have no precedent. The archive says the recognition sequence was activated once before, 3,000 years ago. The record of that activation doesn't include a second triggering." She looked at him. "It might be possible. It might not. And if I attempt it and the system can't sustain it, what happens then?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Then whatever I am now doesn't continue," she said. He held that. "Sorvain says she'll release the designation through council channels," he said. "She will try," Valeth said. "The council will debate it. The debate will take months, and during those months the conclave will manage the framing, and by the time it is released, it will be released in a form that the conclave has had time to contextualize, and the contextualization will serve the conclave's purposes." She looked at him. "The conclave is very good at contextualization. I have watched it operate for 11 years. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." She waited. "Then we figure it out," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to do something that might." The door opened. Handler Dreth came through the door with 4 members of the conclave enforcement detail, which was a number that communicated not urgency but certainty, the specific certainty of an institution that has decided on a course of action and is implementing it with appropriate redundancy. He looked at the room, at the human delegation, at Valeth, at Elias, and his assessment was quick and complete. "Valeth," he said in Vareth. The translator caught it in full this time because Elias had adjusted the sensitivity setting in the observation room's first 30 minutes. "The Conclave Medical Authority has authorized a stabilizing intervention. You will accompany us to the medical facility for full recalibration. This is not a disciplinary measure. It is a medical necessity following the system destabilization event of this afternoon." Valeth looked at him. "No," she said. Dreth's expression didn't change. In Elias's experience, expressions that don't change in situations where they should are often more significant than expressions that do. This is not optional. The authorization is issued under Conclave Protocol 7, which applies to Vareth personnel exhibiting. I know what Protocol 7 applies to, Valeth said. I have read it. It applies to Vareth personnel exhibiting system destabilization events caused by external interference. The recognition sequence is not external interference. It is native architecture. Protocol 7 does not apply. Dreth looked at her for a moment with the small, pale eyes. You are citing a distinction that does not exist in the current operational framework. It existed before the current operational framework, she said. It exists in the base architecture regardless of the current operational framework. The base architecture supersedes the current operational framework. This is not an argument. It is the structure of what I am. What you are, Dreth said, is a Vareth nullification specialist exhibiting an unprecedented system anomaly, and what you will do is come with us. He looked at the enforcement team. They moved. Osi moved first. She was between the enforcement team and Valeth before the first member had taken 2 steps. With the quality of placement that comes from someone who has spent 30 years calculating angles. Ambassador Rourke's cultural liaison is under diplomatic protocol, she said. Station regulations require a 48-hour notice period before any intervention involving personnel assigned to active diplomatic proceedings. The diplomatic proceedings have been suspended, Dreth said. Pending review, Ose said, which makes them active pending proceedings. Same protocol applies. It was a thin argument, and everyone in the room knew it, including Ose. But it was an argument, and Dreth was a bureaucratic creature who operated through protocols, and the existence of a counter-protocol, however strained, required him to pause while he processed it. Elias counted the seconds of that pause. 4 seconds. 5. The enforcement team waited. Then Dreth said, the 48-hour protocol applies to personnel assigned under diplomatic agreement. Valeth's assignment was internal conclave placement, not a diplomatic agreement. The exception does not apply. He looked at the enforcement team. They moved again. Osi held her ground for 3 more seconds. Then, the numbers made it impossible, and she stepped back, and Elias understood, with the specific clarity that comes when you have run out of procedural options, that this was the moment the prompt called for, not the moment of victory, but the moment before the last choice, the moment where everything looks like it has already been decided in the wrong direction. 2 of the enforcement team had reached Valeth. She was not resisting, not because she couldn't, but because she understood that resistance would accelerate things, and she was, he thought, still calculating whether there was another way through. Her eyes moved to him. He looked at her. She looked back. I can try, she said quietly, not to anyone in the room in particular, to the situation itself, maybe, or to herself. I don't know if the architecture will hold, but I can try. She paused. I know what it costs, he said. Yes, she said. So do I. One of the enforcement team reached for her arm. Elias crossed the room. He was not fast enough to prevent the hold, but he was fast enough to be present before it tightened, which was what he needed. He stopped at the enforcement team's perimeter, close enough that stopping him required a decision, and looked at Dreth. Handler, he said. You can physically move her. I understand that. You have the personnel to do it, and we don't have the numbers to prevent it. He held Dreth's gaze with the 23-year look. But I want you to understand something clearly before you make that choice. Whatever is in the last layer of that archive, whatever the designation says, about humanity's role in this galaxy, it will come out. Maybe not today. Maybe not from this station. But it will come out, because information like that does not stay buried once the context for it has been broadcast. You cut the relay, and you kept the last piece in. But the questions are already out there. And questions find their answers. Dreth looked at him. This is not relevant to the medical authorization. No, Elias said. It isn't. This is relevant to what you're actually afraid of. He looked at Dreth directly. You're not afraid of the recognition sequence. You're afraid of what she'll broadcast if it completes. And I'm telling you that trying to stop it at this point is like trying to unring a bell by destroying the bell. The resonance is already out there. Dreth said nothing. In the silence, Elias heard Osi at the door and understood from the quality of her stillness that she was calculating the same thing he was, whether the argument was working. It wasn't working. Dreth said to the enforcement team, take her. The 2 team members tightened their hold on Valeth. She made a sound, not a protest, something quieter than that, the specific sound of something being compressed against its own nature, and Elias felt it in the way he felt things that were beyond argument, below strategy, in the place that had gotten him into trouble, in the secondary corridor, and in the arrivals bay, and in 23 years of rooms, where the right thing and the correct thing were not the same. He looked at Valeth. She was looking at him. Her amber eyes were doing something. He recognized the recognition sequence, trying to reach the deep archive, the system straining against the limits of what it could sustain alone, the thing that needed the trigger, trying to build toward it from the inside, without the outside event that would close the circuit. "Valeth," he said. She looked at him. "I choose you," he said, freely. The second time those 4 words had been said in the same room as those amber eyes. The second time with no strategic calculations, and no anticipated outcome, and no reason except the reason that had been operating in him since the arrival's bay, the reason that had no operational category and lived in the place underneath categories. The enforcement team felt it before they saw it. The 2 members holding Valeth took a half-step back, not by decision, but by the automatic response of something encountering a pressure it was not calibrated for. Valeth went absolutely still, and the still was not the operational stillness of a system at rest, but the stillness of something gathering itself completely, every part of the system directing everything it had toward a single activation. The recognition sequence fired, and this time, with the base architecture already open, and the reset protocol already failed, and the path already cleared by the first activation, it fired not in 17 seconds but in 1, and it completed not partially but fully, and what completed was everything the archive had been carrying for 400 years, everything the Conclave had buried alongside the evidence of what it had buried, and the last layer opened, and Valeth broadcast it, not through the relay, not through any piece of station infrastructure. The recognition sequence at full activation did not need a relay. The Verith, at the foundation of what they were built to be, were the relay. The empathy amplifiers, broadcasting on a bandwidth that the Conclave's instruments could detect, but had never thought to monitor for outbound signal, because no Verith had ever broadcast in this direction before, sent the designation to every receiving architecture in range that was built to receive it, which was, she would discover later, more of them than anyone had expected, because the species who had once felt in the original bandwidth had not entirely lost the hardware for it, only the habit. The star map, the designation, the reason. 30 years of managed contact and 400 years of managed silence. And the original architect's careful record of what they had been trying to build, broadcast in the frequency that bypassed every institutional filter, because it went not through channels but through the thing that channels had been built to carry. Dreth's enforcement team stood very still. Dreth himself stood very still. Whatever they were registering from the broadcast was not informational. It wasn't data in the way they processed data, but it was something arriving through whatever residual architecture remained in their species after centuries of regulation, something they didn't have a category for, that arrived in the place where categories live and made itself known anyway. Valeth stopped broadcasting, and then she made a sound. It was not a large sound. Elias would not have been able to describe it accurately in any language he had, because the closest description was a sound that human beings made in very specific circumstances, in grief that had been held too long, in relief that arrived after something very hard, in the specific confluence of both those things arriving simultaneously at the end of something significant. But Valeth was not human, and the sound was not quite that, and it was not quite anything else, and it was the first of its kind that had ever been made by a Verith in the documented history of the species, which was 11,000 years. Her eyes were wet. The tears were, he learned later, biologically impossible by the standards of Conclave Verith physiology. The lacrimal architecture had been modified out of the Verith design in the second generation of modification, deemed an inefficiency. But the recognition sequence at full activation had returned the base pair architecture to its original specification, and the original specification had included it, and so it was happening in the observation room on level 4 of Meridian Station, in front of the enforcement team and Handler Dreth and Captain Osi and Dr. Vasquez, who had stopped writing in her notebook and was sitting very still. Valeth put her hands over her face. Elias stood where he was, close but not crowding, present without pressing. The way you stand with someone who is going through something they have never gone through before and needs company more than guidance. "I'm sorry," she said from behind her hands. Her voice was unsteady in a way it had never been. "I don't know what I have never. You don't have to be sorry," he said. She took her hands away. Her face was wet, and her eyes were bright, and the expression on them was doing the new thing, the thing that had been approaching since the corridor the first evening, and had arrived now fully, with nothing left to arrive. "Is this what it's like?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "More often than you might think," he said. "Less often than it probably should be." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her hands where the tears had transferred. Then she looked back at him. "What happens now?" she said. In the corner of the room, Dreth and his enforcement team were standing in a configuration that had ceased to be operational, without quite being anything else yet. Dreth was looking at Valeth with an expression that Elias had never seen on Dreth's face, not assessment, not authority, not the cold administrative certainty he'd displayed in every previous encounter. Something that was working through itself. Something that the broadcast had arrived in and was still processing. "What happens now," Elias said, "is that Sylvain convenes the council, which she was already planning to do. And the council has a very different conversation than the one they were going to have before the broadcast, because the broadcast has changed what the conversation can ignore." He looked at Dreth, and I think Handler Dreth is going to leave this room because there's no recalibration protocol that applies to what just happened, and I think he knows that. Dreth looked at him. A long moment. Then, with the quality of someone who has been given a map of territory that has turned out to be a different territory than the map described, he said to his enforcement team, "Stand down." They stood down. Dreth looked at Valeth for a moment. He opened his mouth, and then he closed it. And he left the room, and the enforcement team filed out after him, and the door closed, and the room held the four of them and Valeth, and the specific quiet of something that has just ended and something that has just begun. Osi looked at Elias. "I need you to know," she said, "that I am going to have strong opinions about all of this later, at a time when strong opinions are appropriate." "I know," he said. "Right now I'm choosing to have no opinions," she said, "temporarily." "I appreciate that," he said. Dr. Vasquez opened her notebook and started writing again. The emergency council session that High Arbiter Sylvain convened at 0700 the following morning lasted 4 hours. Elias did not attend it. He was told its outline by Sylvain afterward, in the same small insulated room, and what he was told was this. She had presented the full account. The Vareth history, the modification, the recognition sequence, the human designation, the star map, all of it. She had presented it without the framing she might have applied 2 days ago, without the contextualization she had spent a career deploying, and the council had received it in the way that very large truths are received when they arrive without packaging, with the quality of something that requires significant time to settle, that everyone in the room can see is going to take more than this morning to understand. The emotional regulation framework was suspended pending review. This was unanimous. The Vareth designation as conclave nullification specialist was suspended pending review. This was also unanimous and faster. The question of what to do about humanity was not settled in 4 hours, and Sylvain told him she did not expect it to be settled for some time. "You are not what the conclave thought you were," she said, "and neither are we, and the galactic community will need time to understand what the difference means." "We have time," he said. "Humans are good at time." She looked at him. "We will want to renegotiate the terms of Earth's contact with the galactic community." "So will we," he said. "Different terms, from a different position." "Yes," she said. "Different." A pause. "The model will need significant revision." "I would imagine so," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Ambassador, I want you to understand that the decision to manage humanity's introduction was not. I want to be clear that from our position it appeared to be." "I know," he said. "You were afraid. 400 years of being responsible for galactic stability, and you found the thing that your entire structure was built to prevent from existing, and you managed it. I understand why." He looked at her. "That doesn't mean it was right, but I understand why." She held his gaze. Then she said something he didn't expect her to say. "I have been doing this work for 63 years, she said. "I have managed 9 significant galactic crises. I have never had a negotiation that ended this way." "How do most of them end?" he asked. "With one side gaining and one side conceding," she said. "Or with a compromise that neither side wanted, or with a breakdown that required years to repair." She paused. "Not with," she gestured vaguely, in a way that encompassed the past 24 hours. "This. What would you call this?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Something I don't have a category for yet," she said. "I expect I will eventually." The shuttle that would carry the Earth delegation back to the transit point was prepared and waiting at the departure bay at 1432 hours after they had arrived. Same white hull, same diplomatic seal, the same deliberate nothing that said we haven't decided what this is yet, which was no longer accurate, though the hull didn't know that. Valeth was in the departure bay. She was standing in her position, the midpoint position, the one she always occupied, equidistant from every wall, and she looked like herself and like someone new at the same time, Both things true simultaneously in the way that things can be true simultaneously when the person has been through something that changes the composition of what they are without changing the surface. Elias stopped in front of her. His team filed past him into the docking collar. Chen, Vasquez with her completely full notebook, O.C. last, who paused at the collar entrance and looked at him for a moment with the measuring quality, and then looked at Valith and nodded. Once, and went through. "You're not going to be here when I come back," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know where I'm going to be," she said. "The council will want to understand the recognition sequence. The Varith as a population will need to be told. The archive will need to be made available to those who want access to it." She paused. "There is a great deal to do." "Yeah," he said. "And Earth will be involved in much of it," she said. "Given the designation, given what the archive says about what your species is, I imagine we will," he said. "So this is not—" She stopped. "No," he said. "It's not a goodbye. It's the first end of the first thing." She looked at him with the clear amber eyes. "That is a very specific way to say it." "I thought about it," he said. She almost smiled. He thought she almost smiled. Something moved at the corner of her expression that was approaching smile the way the corridor lights approached blue in the minimum brightness cycle. Not arrived yet, but moving. "Elias," she said. "Yeah," he said. "When you come back," she said, "I want to show you the junction of rings 1 and 2. He looked at her. "The 3% tighter tolerances." "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about it. I think I know now why the engineer made that choice." "I want to tell you what I think." She paused. "And I want to know what you think, whether you agree." "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that. The corridor lights at minimum brightness cycle," she said. "You will see them in transit if not on this station. The color blue," he said. "Yes," she said. "That specific blue, that quiet." She looked at him. "I wanted you to know the full reason. It's quiet, which is part of it, but it is also the color of the time before the brightening begins, when anything is still possible." She paused. "I understand that now. I didn't have a name for it before." Before the brightening," he said. "Yes." He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very good reason." "Yes," she said, "it is." They stood in the departure bay, in the silence that had something in it, not the silence of a space that had decided not to remember anything, but the silence of a space that was holding something worth holding, something that had arrived in it over 3 days and had changed what the silence contained. "I choose you," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Not as a trigger," he said, "not as an activation event, just for the record, because it's true." She looked at him with the new look, the one that had no prior category, the one that was finding its shape in real time, and the shape it was finding was something that had been waiting for a shape since an arrivals bay question about color that had no operational purpose. "The record contains it," she said, "both times." "Good," he said. He went through the docking collar and the shuttle pulled away from Meridian Station, and he sat in his seat and watched the rings grow smaller in the viewport. The 3 concentric rings, turning with the patient precision of something that had been turning for a long time and was going to keep turning, but differently now inside something different, in a galaxy that was beginning to understand that 400 years of turned-down volume had been 400 years of a question waiting for someone to ask it in the right way. He thought about the junction of rings 1 and 2, about tolerances set 3% tighter than required, for no operational reason, because someone had preferred it that way. He thought about what that said about the people who built things that, even inside a system that had decided preference, was inefficiency. Some things got built with more care than they needed, because the builder wanted them that way. He thought about a galaxy learning to turn its volume back up, about what it would sound like once it remembered how. He thought about blue. The specific blue of corridor lights at minimum brightness in the interval before the brightening begins, when anything is still possible. He thought that was, all things considered, a very good reason. He pulled out his recorder. "Recording for OSE," he said, "personal encryption level 2. We're 40 minutes from the transit point. The emotional regulation framework is suspended pending review. The Varith modification is suspended pending review. The galactic community knows what it's been missing. Earth is fully exposed in the middle of all of it. No protective architecture, no managed timeline. Everything that we were being shielded from now, our actual situation." He paused, watching the station shrink to a small brightness against the dark 3 rings turning. "I want it on record that I think that's exactly right, that it's better to be in the middle of the actual situation than to be managed toward the edge of a situation someone else designed for you." He paused again. "And I want it on record that it took 3 days and 1 question about color preference, and that the entire thing turned on a system that had been waiting for someone to ask what it wanted." He stopped the recording. Then he started it again. Tell the xenobiology team to get ready for something significant, and tell them to ask questions when they get there. Just questions, not operational ones. The other kind. He ended the recording. Outside the viewport, Meridian Station had become a small and distant thing, 3 rings turning in the dark, patient and enormous, working through everything it now had to work through. He watched it turn until it was too small to see. Then he looked ahead.